Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Longhurst to you. I know many of you have heard him before. I recall his first lecture on Islam, art and sacred Islamic art, wasn't it? And Islamic sacred art. And being very surprised, sort of from a Western perspective, expecting we were going to see pictures and instead being introduced to music and writing. So a nice surprise, and extending, of course, our knowledge and understanding of another culture. So I'm sure that Chris is going to have some more surprises for us, and I'm just going to hand over to him. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam.
The Sufi, meanwhile dancing, but at the center remains absolutely immobile, as if at the center of a cyclone. The dance is a cyclone. All of the body is in movement. It is fluid, dynamic, but at the center of awareness is observed silence, and nothing will disturb the inner peace. story, or the true story, is about interiority. And the reason why I would like to begin with the dance of the swirling dervish is because it is about peace. And one of the names, or one of the definitions of Islam, is peace. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. You might also wonder or you might be curious as to why a Roman-trained theologian thinks he has something relevant to say about beauty in Islam. Firstly, I approach this subject from a purely knowledge-based point of view, not about belief. And I do so as an academic theologian because of my secondary interest in Islam, which began when I first went to Rome to study theology in the late 1990s. And in an ordinary theology course in Rome, we took subjects, for example, in comparative theology, by which we looked at the relationship between Islam and Christianity and Judaism in the Abrahamic tradition. These were mandatory for the theology degree at the undergraduate level. And also we discussed, for example, interfaith dialogue. So that introduced me to Islam back in the late 1990s. And then at the graduate level, I signed up for a course in Islamic mysticism, which was taught by a professor from an institute in Rome called PSI, which is an acronym for the Pontifical Institute of Islamic Studies and Arabology. And I found that very fascinating. So that was my initial formal introduction to Islam. And that was all very good. And then I went on to study at the doctoral level in 2005. And I was interested in looking at how non-figurative art, abstract expressionism, is relevant for theological discourse. And that was the proposal I made in 2005 to the Faculty of Theology in Rome to study how these extraordinary works of art that are non-figurative, non-representational, and abstract, which allegedly had no value for religion or theology, my argument was how they could be useful for theological discourse. So I began to delve into a mystic of the 5th, 6th century Greek tradition by the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. Because Dionysius talked about how we can talk about the divinity without affirming what the divinity is, by using a Greek term called apophasis, which means to negate what God is, therefore affirm what he is by negating what God is not. And that led to what I'm sure some of you are familiar with, an entire way of looking at God and religion known as the via negativa, or the via apophatica, the apophatic way. And I thought, I'm onto something. I'm now going to connect this world of secular art back to this world of religion. And I was very proud, I thought. And the further I delved into the matter, I began to discover that I was doing something that had already been done many, many centuries ago. And not only had it been done, it was alive and living in a certain tradition. What was that tradition? Islam. And this struck another curiosity. I finished my doctoral work, and I was working in the Vatican museums, and I began to write for the Vatican's semi-official publication, the Roman Observer. The back page was usually a reflection on art and architecture, or the relationship between art and architecture and religion. And I wanted now to write a piece that hopefully L'Osservatore Romano would publish on the beauty of Islamic art and architecture. I was being a little provocative. but I hoped nevertheless the Vatican would publish it. To cut a long story short, it did. But in order not to just do research, I went from Rome to the closest country I could find where I could experience what we could call the culture of a Muslim majority. And that was North Africa, and that was Morocco. And while I was in Morocco, I was immersed also in the Moroccan way of expressing Islam. And that was important because it made a distinction in my mind between how a culture understands a religion and how that religion understands itself. And then that led to my interest in that part of the world, and also to a position that was offered to me to teach at the university level in Morocco at a secular non-denominational university. And I found this very fascinating because they were employing a Roman-trained theologian to teach religion and theology and Islam in a Muslim-majority country. So I take my hat off to that university in the sense that they saw the good in a education or a knowing about in order to teach the majority of their own students. And the graduate students were imams in training. And guess what I was teaching them? Sufism, Islamic mysticism, advanced comparative religions, and the philosophy of religion. So that's why that's basically the background to my interest in Islam. And that's what brings me today to talk about beauty in Islam. So the purpose of our talk is to identify those places where beauty exists on account of the Islamic faith and the lifeway that stems from that faith or is compelled by it. So there are 4 parts to our discussion in this 2 hours, more or less. And the first part is where I'd like to give you some theoretical background regarding beauty and Islam and the relationship between the two. And I'll spend about 20 minutes just talking on that. And then at the end, for about 5 minutes, I'll go over, using an outline that I've made, where I find beauty to exist in Islam, and I'll propose 6 seemingly significant places in about 5 minutes. And then after that, which I hope will be the exciting part, more than the knowledge-based part, we'll look at some practical examples of how in those places Islam is beautiful. And then finally, our discussion, which is also for me very, very enlightening too. And that will take us up to the end. So about 20 minutes of theoretical background, a 5-minute overview of where the places are, where beauty is in Islam, and then about 20 minutes of looking at those places using practical examples. So we're looking at beauty in Islam, and I suspect that many of you here present presume that that means Islamic art and architecture, which is certainly a part of it. However, beauty in Islam concerns much more than simply the arts and architecture of Muslim-majority cultures. Because Islam is first and foremost a universal religion with a worldwide view that subordinates the arts and all human enterprises to itself as part of an integral, God-centered way of life. Although some of you may think that beauty only pertains to artistic expressions, Islam certainly does not. It manifests itself aesthetically through the arts, or it uses the arts to beautify its message, as all religions do. And art is very important in Islam. In fact, throughout the world, there is even a field of study that looks at Islamic art and architecture. However, it would be too easy, I think, and somewhat misleading to talk about beauty in Islam by just looking at the so-called Islamic art and architecture. Again, this is part of the conversation, but beauty also has a philosophical and theological aspect in Islam as well. Furthermore, beauty in Islam entails many other human and non-human enterprises, such as the religious acts and practices of Islam, the aesthetic form of Islam's communal prayer. It's called salat. Or the Prophet Muhammad's words and deeds. They are called the sunnah, and are one of Islam's primary fonts by which Islam draws from in order to understand itself. And of course, the Quran, which is conceived by Muslims to be beyond comparison, both in content and form, and the primary font that Islam draws from in order to understand itself. And also the way Muslims see the order and balance in the universe, the harmony and the unity of the cosmos. All of these contribute towards beauty in Islam. Therefore, when we talk about beauty in Islam, we intend how beauty relates to Islam based on place or whereabouts. So then we can talk about and philosophically talk about beautiful Islam. Or if we treat of the arts and architecture of Islamic cultures, then we can talk about a beautified Islam. But firstly, regarding definitions, I think which is important in order to understand the framework by which we understand beauty. The field of study that looks at beauty is aesthetics, and typically defined as the philosophy of art and taste. Though when religion addresses aesthetics, it usually goes beyond art and taste to consider spiritual and cosmological realities as well. This involves the study of God and divine beauty and the beauty of creation and created realities, which forms a specific interdisciplinary field of knowledge called theological aesthetics. While aesthetics sees beauty as the proper object and end of art, philosophy sees beauty as a property which adheres in things by which they become pleasing to us upon being apprehended. Things such as a religion is beautiful because it is pleasing, or human objects, or natural objects such as a flower, a tree. Human objects would entail an artwork, or a building, or a melody of sounds, or literature, or even rhythmic movement. And they would all be considered beautiful insofar as they are pleasing to the senses, or pleasing upon being apprehended. I think that's the best philosophical definition of beauty, that which pleases upon being sensed. This establishes a definition for beauty to mean pleasing to the senses, and in art, it is generally to the external senses. Generally, not always, but generally, the external senses, especially to sight and to hearing. And in philosophy and religion, it is also to the internal senses, to the intellect, for example, and to the will. And philosophy and theology will argue that the proper objects of the intellect are truth, and the will, knowledge. Therefore, in religion, truth and knowledge become beautiful insofar as they are apprehended. Therefore, in religion, in general, from a philosophical point of view, things like beauty and truth and knowledge and goodness are convertible, or they are one. This is how the philosophies of the world's religions, the world's major religions, tend to view beauty. And it is certainly how the devout Muslim understands beauty based on the primary sources of their religion, the Quran and the Sunnah. These sources use Arabic words whose meanings seem far richer than the English transliterations suggest. Single Arabic words from the Quran, which mean for us in English beauty, transliterate, for example, as the good, the best, the perfect, the noble, the pleasing, the righteous, and the attractive, and so on. And regarding the meaning of the word Islam, we are talking about the religion and lifeway of the Muslims. From its etymological derivatives, Islam means submission and peace. For Muslims, this is practiced primarily through remembering Allah and submitting to Allah's will and law in the Quran. Therefore, remembrance, in Arabic, dirkh, and submission, in Arabic, Islam, play an important role in Islam's aesthetic bearing and in the Muslim's experience and perception of the world as beautiful. We'll look at some of these in practice shortly. However, beauty in Islam is not concerned with sectarian division, the Sunni-Shia division, for example, but with the general religion and lifeway of all Muslims. In fact, when it comes to beauty, distinctions between Sunni and Shia are irrelevant because beauty unites what separates Sunni and Shia Muslims. And the quality of being beautiful is shared amongst all Muslims. In other words, what makes Shia Islam beautiful is the very same thing that makes Sunni Islam beautiful. And what divides these two, Muslims would consider ugly. So we know what beauty is, and we know what Islam is, that when we talk about beauty in Islam, we encounter the problem of place, or whereabouts. Where is Islam for beauty to be in it? I want to briefly address this problem because Islam is so culturally diverse. And different regions of the world have different Islamic cultures. And they also have different ways of expressing themselves through their cultures, both in the arts and in other ways. Consequently, the visual and sensual expressions of Islam in the world become particularized in culturally diverse forms. And we can talk about beauty in Islam through the whereabouts of those forms. Though beauty in Islam is more than the beautiful forms expressed in Muslim-majority countries. This is an important distinction because, in fact, Islam is not confined to any particular place or cultural identity. Many of us in the West, I fear, when we consider Islam, we tend to think of Islam over there, in the Middle East, in North Africa, or in Southeast Asia, which of course is true. Though this reduces Islam to a foreign place or a distant culture, and to diverse social, artistic, and national styles, and even perhaps to something historical. I think this is quite limited and somewhat misleading when considering beauty in Islam, because Islam is not Arabic or Persian culture, or Ottoman style, or Southeast Asian culture. Islam subsists in all of these, though it also transcends them. So asking where is beauty in Islam, I think what we really mean is how does Islam express itself in the external world in attractive ways? And in what ways does Islam see God, the human person, the world, and all its material objects, both natural and human-made objects, as pleasing? The first considers the beauty which exists in Islam on account of the arts, created specifically for the service of Islam. For example, a mosque and its furnishings and its surface decorations. And in another sense, it also considers the art and architecture produced throughout the centuries in Muslim-majority countries. On that score, anyone with the vaguest knowledge of Islam and Islamic culture would know that Islam has produced some of the most splendid and extraordinary works of art and architecture that the world has ever seen. My favorite is the Dome of the Rock, arguably the oldest Islamic building. The Taj Mahal, the Alhambra in Spain. Persian miniatures. Quranic scripts, poetry, bodily movements, and an entire science of Quranic chanting all constitutes places where Islam may be considered beautiful. Though again, we're not just talking about art, but also about beauty, which is in a sense the object of art, though in Islam it is a supernatural being as well, and a relational property in all things according to that by which they are loved. This is based on a very famous hadith in the Muslim tradition, which says God is beautiful and God loves beauty. This saying captures both the ontological nature of beauty for Muslims and beauty's relational value. This is why Muslim scholars, Ibn Sina, perhaps known to us more as Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, and nearly all the Sufi masters consider beauty as a transcendental property of being, beyond predication, one with being, or one in which its subject and its predicate are the same. Therefore, God is beautiful, and the beautiful is God. Though beauty for the Muslim is also relational, that relationship for Muslims is expressed primarily in Allah's 99 beautiful names, or what the Muslim calls the divine attributes, which, when some of those attributes are extended into the world, and to human persons in particular, here Muslims begin to understand what is meant by the image of God in the universe. And they see that image as beautiful. Therefore, in Islam, beauty possesses a God-centered and relational basis. And this is important for understanding beauty in Islam, because such beauty does not have an end in itself. And this is important, I think, to understand beauty in Islam. Devout Muslims would only understand or or accept the expression that beauty is its own excuse for being, when being, along with beauty and God, are reciprocal, or one, or convertible with each other. So the idea of beauty for its own sake, or art for art's sake, is not tenable in Islam. In other words, all primary enterprises in the world are directed towards the purpose of Islam, which is essentially the beauty of remembering Allah's name and of surrendering to Allah's law and will in the Quran. So in the final analysis, beauty in Islam, I think, comprises a simple and intimate relationship with God, with the world, in human acts, and in all things produced through the arts. Though even this division is somewhat misleading, because in Islam, natural beauty has a spiritual dimension, and for Muslims, artistic beauty is closely related to nature. And in a sense, in Islam, there is no such thing as the artificial. Titus Burckhardt wrote and published prolifically on this subject. He said, "The Muslim artist, by his very Islam, his surrender to the divine law, is always aware of the fact that it is not he who produces or invents beauty, but that a work of art is beautiful to the degree that it obeys the cosmic order and therefore reflects universal beauty." To put this all together, I've created the following outline to understand an overview of beauty in Islam. This is not exhaustive, and in a way incomplete, because I'm making divisions that Muslims wouldn't make. But I'm doing so in order to try to understand how we can understand beauty in Islam. So the first division I make is simply one between the metaphysical realm and the physical realm. And in the metaphysical realm, regarding beauty in Islam, we can talk about beauty in the unity and oneness of God. This is a very important concept in Islam. It's a foundational tenet of Islam, and it's called Tawheed, which means the unity and the oneness implied of God. Therefore, the 99 beautiful names of Allah, or the divine attributes, are in a way one. Though Muslim scholars divide them into attributes of being in God, which are hidden that we don't know, and attributes of action in God, or God's existence, which may be hidden and some may extend into the world. The term and the name for Allah as the hidden in Islam, one of the beautiful names of Allah is Al-Batin. And the name for Allah as the manifest is Az-Sahir. So in the metaphysical realm, beauty in Islam exists in the divine names, but it also exists in the Quran. And this is important, I think, for us outside the Islamic tradition to understand what the Quran actually is for a Muslim. And I think it's important to not make a conceptual comparison based on another standard, which we tend to do sometimes in the West, and if I may, in the Christian tradition, liken the Quran to other sacred scriptures, like the Bible. But this is not how a Muslim understands the Quran as a book. A Muslim understands the Quran as the will and law of God that is spoken to humankind and revealed. Therefore, the Quran is not a book for a Muslim, but it is the revealed will and law of God, or it is the speech of Allah. But the way a Muslim, or the way the Islamic tradition traps this in time and space, is in pages, by writing it down. But it's not those written words, or those pages, or the book that is the Quran, which is that which was heard and that which was spoken. That simply becomes a projection into the world of what most Muslims today, this is arguable in history, but most Muslims today see as something that is uncreated. And that's the problem, I think, for us not understanding sometimes the importance of the Quran and its beauty for a Muslim. And I'll simply make this analysis, which is a comparison, in order to try to understand the beauty of the Quran for a Muslim. Many Christians believe that God's revelation came in the form of a person. And Christians often call that the incarnation, from the Latin incarne, by which God in Christianity takes on flesh, carne, incarnation. I would argue, and I would talk about this, and I've written about this, that as the incarnation is to a Christian, the Quran is to a Muslim, in the sense, even though this is only a conceptual, analogous way of looking at the Quran as beautiful, therefore it's not the Bible to compare with, it's Jesus, by which a person outside of the tradition of Islam could understand the Quran from a Muslim's point of view. So I think we could relate to this insofar as the audience, for the most part, does not seem to be, but this is an assumption I simply make that could be entirely inaccurate, even based on my own understanding and argument, because you don't need to look in a certain way to be a Muslim or to be Islam, but to understand that what Christians think of Jesus and understand Jesus to be in the Christian tradition, I would argue Muslims think of the Quran as well. And there's a word that's used in academics today, and it's inlibration. And I would say inlibration is to the Quran what incarnation is to Jesus. Meaning, insofar as God becomes a human person, for Christians, God's speech, will and law becomes book for Muslims. In libro, in libration. But that's simply a conceptual analysis in order to understand the metaphysical context of beauty in Islam. Therefore, we're not talking about a book when we talk about the Quran. And the Quran is not just written. It's spoken. Therefore, this introduces an extraordinary art that I came across in Morocco when I was visiting the madrasah, the Quranic schools. Because what young Muslim students will do is learn the Quran not to know just the content of the Quran, but to chant the Quran, thereby participating in this primordial act of revelation of Allah to the world that becomes temporalized in the 7th century, the Common Era, through an Arab Meccan, Muhammad. So that's the two places where I see the metaphysical realm of beauty, in the divine attributes and in the Quran. And then we can talk about beauty in the physical realm, and Muslims in a certain tradition, which is the mystical tradition, or the Sufi tradition again, which is very easily arguable as Islamic, simply based on Sufis reciting the Shahada, which is the Islamic profession, although it's not always popular, the mystical side in Islam, in the more traditional branches of Islamic law, for example. Nevertheless, when we look at the physical realm, the unity and oneness of the universe is a term in Islam that is called Wadat al-Wujud, which is now, we can talk about the unity and oneness in God and the unity and oneness in the world. And that's considered by Muslims to be extraordinarily beautiful. And that entails, in things, natural beauty, therefore creation, of course, and in things human-made, or what we might call artificial beauty, art. And in Islam, the three major places where beauty exists in things are the arts of the book, which sees the Quran also as created, but not created in the metaphysical way, but created by masters of the arts of the book who trap the will and law of God in letters, in calligraphy, in scripts, and also in illuminating the book, in illustrating the book, and also in bookbinding. And this becomes an important practice called the arts of the book in Islam. And we'll look at some of them shortly. They're extraordinarily beautiful. And then the other artificial or human-made font or place where beauty is in Islam is, of course, architecture. Architecture understood as binding space. And we see this in the mosque. But this is very important to make a quick distinction that the Muslim will make. The mosque is not a building. Muslims use the art of bounding space to confine space for their purposefulness. A mosque is a place of prostration. And we'll look at some examples shortly by which places of prostration, which are mosques, don't have bounded space. But nevertheless, when Islam adopts the art of binding space in its temporal context, which it in many ways adapts, inherits from the pre-Islamic traditions, the Byzantine especially, it, I would argue, reduces the mosque to a space that's bounded. And that space becomes, in a way that is competitive with the Byzantine tradition, beautiful according to Islam's own outlook on the world, which is non-figurative and non-representational, and one could argue aniconic. And therefore, you have beautiful buildings like the Dome of the Rock. And you have spaces inside the mosque that we'll look at shortly. And one which is important is the mihrab, which becomes one of the most beautiful, decorated parts of the mosque. The prayer niche, which is in the wall, the Qibla wall, that is the wall of the mosque that directs towards Mecca. That indentation in the wall becomes an object of Islamic ornamentation. And the other way is also in the surface decoration, in arabesques as things. And then so in the physical realm, there is beauty in Islam through things, and there is beauty in Islam through actions. And again, I make a division between the natural and the human. And in actions, Muslims will see beauty in creation and in evolution, the evolving of creation. And there's a specific name of Allah that I'll look at shortly, which I find fascinating, that expresses this concept of natural beauty, which is the inspiration for the beauty that comes in the created arts of Islam. And then the human, in actions, we consider moral, which are what Muslims would understand as the beauty of their own acts of faith. And these are commonly called the 5 pillars of Islam, and also the beauty of the Prophet's speech and actions, which is the Sunnah. And then regarding the human in actions as well, we have things like tilawah, which is the action of reciting the Quran, which becomes an art. Tilawah, the art of Quranic recitation, and the art of dance, both in order to remember Allah. Cast your mind back to the whirling dervish. Without going too much into that, the concept of tawheed is projected into the body as, for example, if you understand this in a heliocentric context, The body becomes, for example, a center by which the entire world is revolving around it. And as this exists, one could argue, in the cosmos, that same sense of centering is taken on in the human body. Islam certainly doesn't have hegemony over this concept of centering through bodily movement, but it certainly has an extraordinarily beautiful way of manifesting it through the whirling dervish. So in the end, where is beauty in Islam? I identify from the aforementioned 6 primary places, and I'm not sure whether this is exhaustive. It may not be. I'm not sure even if it is entirely complete. However, from my analysis, where is beauty in Islam? In the world, through creation and evolution. In the Muslims' fundamental acts, or Islam's 5 pillars. In the arts, in sensory manifestations through shapes and sounds and bodily movements. In the nature of Islam's 2 main institutions, which are the Quran and the mosque and their corresponding arts. And in the prophets, in their words and deeds, which, remember, are the prophets, all the prophets of the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, as well as the Prophet Muhammad. And finally, in God and God's divine attributes. Okay, so that brings us to the end of my introduction and analysis and overview of the 6 places. What I'd like to quickly do now, which I hope you will enjoy, is look at, just briefly, just a couple of examples of where the practical examples of where there is beauty in each of these 6 places. Regarding the first, as I mentioned, we can talk about how beauty in Islam consists in the world. And again, one of the 99 beautiful names of Allah is one of my favorites, the 13th, Al-Musawwir. Al-Musawwir. It generally translates as the fashioner of forms. Generally, if we can translate Musawwir. Because my Muslim colleagues in Morocco criticize me for trying to translate Arabic words that affirm the names of God. And then I argue, I'm an academic theologian, this is what I do. But that never placates everyone. Nevertheless, I do it with all respect. Al-Musawwir generally translates as the fashioner of forms. Al-Musawwir. We can also talk about the bestower of forms, or the shaper. In the Quran, at Surah 59, verse 24, it states, He is Allah, Al-Halag, which translates the creator, Al-Bari, which translates the shaper, and Al-Musawwir, which translates as the fashioner of forms. So Al-Musawwir denotes the one who arranges forms and colors and shapes and the beauty of the universe. And apparently science has just discovered, and this is on the news today, that there are many new species of plants that have just come into existence. A Muslim would see those as the results of Al-Musawwir. Therefore, we can talk about God and the cosmos as the fashioner of forms and all things in the universe, and one who has given everything its special form and special manner by which it is distinguished. And this becomes important in Islamic art, because when you look at certain forms, and these will be familiar to all of us, they become the inspiration by which a Muslim would create a surface decoration or a form of beautifying the world. For example, you can take any form in nature and look at what a Muslim would understand as its geocentric unity. Therefore, Tawheed, one could talk about in the Kina, insofar as you have the center, and you have the balance and the relationship and the harmony that extends outside the center. You have the Koru and the unfolding of the form. And I'm sure in your mind you'll see how also a wonderful connection can be made between the aesthetic of the Maori and the aesthetic of the Muslim. The beauty in the form of the power. These all become inspirations for what becomes known later as the arabesque. The balance and the harmony in the wings of a butterfly, the scales of a fish. Again, Tawheed. This extends into a form of art which may simply be decorative, but for the Muslim there's no such thing as simply decoration, I would argue, even though scholars will disagree with this. Oliver Layman, for example, a professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky, argues against this theory. But I would argue against him by saying that you have to understand that the aesthetic of Islam does not have an end in itself, but is directed towards the overall purposefulness of Islam, which means remembering Allah. Therefore, you can see, for example, through the unity, the unilateral unity of the arabesque, which extends over into other art forms too, which are arguably Islamic. This is seen easily, for example, in how a Muslim would translate a flower into a tessellation, into a form which becomes the hallmark of Islamic visual decoration. We see it again. The unity and balance, the oneness, one could argue, simply in the harmony of the interior of a fruit or a flower translated into an arabesque. Also, the unity and the oneness and the repetition of honey cells caused by the bee become, when you go into a mosque, what is called, and Muslims understand as morganas, that decorate many niches, many interior domes, and the mihrab inside a mosque. The second place, of course, quickly is beauty in Islam. Muslims understand this as consisting in Islam's basic acts, or Islam's 5 pillars. If life's purpose for a Muslim is to remember and submit to God, then this is achieved for Muslims in 5 ways. The first way is Islam's confession, the shahada, or a testimony. This a Muslim would understand as the beauty in believing in the oneness of God, Tawheed, because the confession declares that there is no God but God. La ilallah illallah. There is no God but God. That's the first part of the shahada. And the second part will testify that Muhammadur Rasul Allah. Muhammad is the messenger of God. So in that confession, a Muslim sees the beauty of the oneness of God, Tawheed. Secondly, in ritual prayer, it's extraordinary to observe how the Muslim prays. The beauty of praying together, of going to the mosque to pray in community is considered a beautiful act. It's morally and aesthetically beautiful because it's based on synchronic acts, order and repetition. Each salah is made up of repeating units or cycles called rakats, made up of parts which involve standing, bowing, prostrating, sujood, sitting, and the greeting of taslim, assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, meaning may Allah grant you peace and security, and may God's mercy be upon you. So that's the second pillar. There's also another element of beauty that revolves around salah, and that's the Muslim's obligation to wash and purify the body. And this is a ritual called wudu in Islam, by which the Muslim is cleansed or cleaned in order to enter the place of cleanliness, which is one of Islam's requirements for a mosque, which are very few, but the place simply needs to be clean. And the Muslim would see this cleanliness as beautiful. Also in mandatory prayer, mandatory giving, zakat or charity, the beauty of charitable works, or material favor, which is done to assist the needy. This is equivalent in the Christian tradition to almsgiving. The fourth pillar in fasting, Saum, during Ramadan. This is the beauty of moderation, or the beauty of practicing the virtue of temperance. And finally, in pilgrimage, in Islam's Hajj to Mecca, which is considered a beautiful act. And when you look at it, I would argue from also an objective point of view, if I could, that it is an extraordinarily beautiful act insofar as the movement of the Muslim around the center of what Islam sees in the world as the Kaaba, and the mosque, all the mosques throughout the world focusing on the Kaaba, becomes like a wheel, and the Kaaba is at the center of the wheel, and at the end of every spike is a mosque. Again, this concept of unity and oneness now projected into a pilgrimage. A Muslim would see that pilgrimage as aesthetically beautiful and morally beautiful as well. The third place, and this is which tends to interest most people, consists of the arts in Islam, in Islam's sensory manifestations, in what is seen, in the letters, Islamic calligraphy, also in arabesques, and in shapes in the world. For example, what we often consider the Ogi arch, or the horseshoe-shaped arch, which embellish buildings that we often identify as Islamic, which of course is not wrong, but not accurate insofar as the arch is not Islamic. But it becomes a module by which the arch shares space or unifies. Therefore it is adopted from the Roman tradition, perhaps. Again, the Muslim sees the most beautiful act in the visual arts as in writing the words of the Quran. Focuses on the letters. So we can talk about the art of the letters. Muslim artist Uzma Mirza states, in Islam, for the Muslim, the letters, the words, and the verses of the Quran are not just elements of written language, but mystical, profound entities of a sonorous space for which the calligrapher form as the physical and visual vessel for the human entering the space of spiritual consciousness. This is important because Mirza immediately connects the written word with the sounded word. Therefore, Muslims see the Quranic script and the Quranic recitation as important ways of remembering Allah. In Islam, this takes on an entire science and school. of different styles of transcription. Without going too much into this, just to introduce you to the two main styles, the Kufic and the Nashr. The Kufic is famous for its angular and strong letters, and the Nasr is famous for its more cursive style. And in these two styles, the Kufic and the Nashr, there are many sub-styles. Nasr is well defined by its more fluid and ornamental appearance. It's probably the most abundant style used in the transcription of the Quran. It's also used in official announcements and also in private correspondence. It became the basis for the modern Arabic script. Taluth is a variation on the Nashr. This developed as a display script, particularly for holy objects, to decorate them in the early Ottoman tradition. Its letters, as you can see, have long vertical lines and broad spacing. The Talik is a cursive script, originally devised to write the Persian language for literary and non-Quranic works. Talik means hanging and refers to the slightly steeped lines of which words run in together with a loop, giving the script a hanging appearance. Dilawani is a cursive style developed also in the early Ottoman Empire, 16th century and 17th centuries. It's rather difficult to read and write due to its heavy stylization. Therefore, it became the ideal script for writing court documents because it was slow to cause forgery. And then we have the Muhakkak, which is considered perhaps the most majestic style. Certainly perhaps one of the most beautiful scripts, as well as also the most difficult to perform. And this often decorates the outside of mosques. Shapes. The arabesque is a form of surface decoration based on rhythmic linear patterns or scrolling and interlacing folial tendrils. It is often combined with other elements such as calligraphy. It's commonly called foliate ornamentation. It typically uses leaves and is derived from stylized half palmets. The arabesque is used in tiles in which it becomes highly repetitive, which underscores the concept of infinity for the Muslim. And it's based on the 8-pointed star, which again is a form of what we could understand as unilateral symmetry, which extends into balance and harmony through the interposition of forms within it. And this becomes the art of the arabesque, by which it becomes even more intricate and complex, to the point where it takes on tile-colored formations, which becomes the basis of surface decoration for not just mosques, but also places throughout Muslim-majority countries in ordinary, everyday, applied arts. an Arabic pattern inside a mihrab, around a wash basin in a public space in Morocco, or a fountain, whereas we may see this simply as beautiful, which arguably it is. A Muslim would see it also as beautiful, but also underscoring Tawheed, or the unity and oneness of Allah. As you can see, simply various fountains throughout the Muslim world. So we've looked at the arts of the book. Sound is very important as a manifestation of the primordial sound as well from Allah, which again is common in many religious traditions. In Islam, there is a practice called remembering Allah, dhikr, and devotional acts in Islam revolve around Muslims now transforming that idea of remembering God by repetition into sound. By repeating phrases, usually Allah's 99 divine names, or the first 4 names which underscore the essence of God in Islam. Ar-Rahmani, Ar-Rahim.
Who is the lover? Allah. Who is Ar-Rahman? Allah. Who is Al-Mannan? La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Muhammad is the messenger, to Allah is our return. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Muhammad is the messenger, to Allah is our return. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. All praise is due to the one and only. He is the master of all creation. All praise is due to the one and only. He is the master of all creation. He is the sustainer and the maintainer of the whole universe. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. Muhammad is the messenger, to Allah is our return.
Of course, that's supposed to be listened to and not watched on YouTube. This remembrance is performed for a Muslim with the beads, which become an instrument by which the Muslim remembers the 99 divine names of Allah and recites them mentally or through dhikr, through chant. We saw the swirling dervish before, and here we see, looking at the swirling dervish, this conceptual analysis can be made between the movement of the dervish and the eye of the storm. And also, if you're interested and you note the movement of the dervish, the formation of the arms are important too, by which one arm faces down and the other arm faces up as the dervish swirls, therefore showing the unity between the earth and the universe, or the heavens, by which one could argue perhaps in a way, despite the monotheism of Islam, that there's this dualism as well, as in the Christian tradition. I think this is one of my favorite places. This is the mosque in Rome, and I like it because of the geometric shapes inside it, which underscore through fractal geometry this concept of unity as well. Of course, this is a mosque, but it's using a Roman architectural morpheme as well, which it's borrowing from. because it understands that, and one of the forms of the mosque that we'll see shortly is the central plan, or the dome, and you see it quite well here, by which even to the untrained eye you feel the unity and the oneness of a space like this, which is important to Muslims in Islam. Kind of looks like a palm tree here on the far left as well. This is the Grand Mosque in Rome, Italy. And of course, remembrance again, this is the Kaaba, which is considered the center of the world for Muslims, and is also important from the point of view of beauty, and it's highly decorated with scripts from the Quran, Quranic texts, and also with cloths that are heavily embroidered. Tilawah is important, simply to know and understand. You'll often, if you enter a mosque, see Muslims sitting together and reciting the Quran, but they do so in an extraordinary, elegant way, because this becomes for the student of the Quran in the madrasas a science, and there is a science that revolves around the elocution and the way to chant the Quran or to recite the Quran, and this becomes known as tajweed, which is the science of elocution, the science of beautiful speech. I want to give you an example to hear.
غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا قيما لينذر بأسا شديدا من لدنه ويبشر. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور.
One of the most beautiful sounds in Islam also is the adhan, the call to prayer, which indeed, of course, is functionary, but is also considered in Islam a beautiful act. And when it is done well, arguably it will stimulate through what sound does to the senses. Here's an example of the adhan, the call to prayer. Again, I invite you to close your eyes if you wish, because we're supposed to hear this and not watch a video nevertheless.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على
You may appreciate this one because of the context in which it takes place, and also I'd like to just show it to you because it has underneath also the English words for what's being said in the Arabic.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح.
حي على الفلاح
Of course, not all call to prayers will sound like that, but a Muslim will hear that 5 times a day in a Muslim majority country, and it plays on the concept of dhikr, remembrance, by which the day is sanctified as well. I find it interesting to note simply also, if you read the English translation of the call to prayer, notwithstanding the one verse that refers to Muhammad as the Prophet of Allah, there is an extraordinary unity that all monotheists can benefit from in reciting or saying the call to prayer. Thus, this was performed in a church in the United States of America to commemorate and celebrate unity in interfaith dialogue among the rabbi on the left, the minister on the right, and the muezzin, the caller to prayer. And the second to last place where beauty exists in Islam, we looked at the Quran. These are examples of calligraphy, or the Quran illuminated. This is a page of a 16th century manuscript from the Quran that says in the center there in Arabic, they would never produce its like, nor though they backed one another. Syed Hossein Nasr is a professor at Washington University in the United States, and a prolific writer on Islamic art and architecture too. He says the primordial creative act was at once the primordial word, which is the origin of all sound, and of the noble Quran as a sonoral universe, and the primordial point, which is the origin of the sacred calligraphy, that is the visual embodiment of the sacred word. The primordial word was not only the single kun, of be, to be, whose echo created the whole universe, and which is contained in the noble Quran as sound. It was also crystallized in the ink with which the divine pen, al-Kalam, wrote the realities of all things upon the Quran as the mother of books. And then the other institution I identify, as we know, is the mosque. And simply, by way of a quick overview, mosques tend to follow one of 2 kinds of bounding of space: the open plan and the enclosed. This is an example of Islamic architecture. Technically, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque, but you certainly see the concept of enclosed space here, and how lavishly this is decorated with both the Quranic script around the top and also the turquoise and blue tessellations and arabesques. The arch concept again, notice the sense of unity, arch within arch within arch within arch, this repetition, which could in a visual context symbolize unity and infinity. The important modules of the mosque are the minaret, the mihrab, the masula, and the minbar. The little booklet that you have has some examples. The mihrab, and these are simply Arabic words which would translate into English. The mihrab is the tower, the watchtower, where traditionally the call to prayer would stand to call to prayer. Muslims. It's no longer functional as a place to call to prayer today in the Muslim world because of technology. However, it's still used as a very important mosque module to identify the Quran and also as a focal point in the landscape, in the architectural landscape of Muslim, majority Muslim cities. The mihrab, as I mentioned, is a beautiful concept, and it's borrowed directly from the Quran, where Zechariah comes out from his prayer niche in the temple and finds Maryam, the mother of Jesus, praying in her prayer niche, in her mihrab. So the mihrab becomes this little niche in a wall. And it could be quite insignificant aesthetically, though it does become, in a way, also the focal point of decoration. And there's a beautiful tradition in the mystical side of Islam that builds on the light, the lamp, al-nur, which is in the mihrab. And this is like the temple, the temple concept of a lamp burning, which is also quite popular in the Christian tradition, especially in the Catholic tradition, and in Anglicanism, by which there's a tabernacle light as well. The masula is a word which means technically place of prayer, and there's discussion over what is a masjid, a mosque, and what is a masula. And I won't get into that right now, but there is in Islamic law, in fiqh, a masula is not a mosque, but anywhere where a Muslim prostrates is a masula, a place of prayer. But this becomes, as I mentioned, in law bound for Muslims to come together to sujood, prostrate, and that becomes a masjid. And that's how we tend to understand a mosque, and that's seen today as a piece of religious architecture, which a Muslim would not see it as, which is important, I think. A Muslim would see it as a place of prayer, not a building. And therefore, there is some conflict today over the identity of the mosque, because also the mosque is a place where Muslims are supported in every way of life. Therefore, the mosque becomes a community center centered around the place of prayer, by which there are social, political, educational, husbandry purposes for the mosque as well. And the minbar is an important decorative piece inside a mosque too, which we would understand as a pulpit. But it's where the imam would, on the Friday, the holy day in Islam, give what's called the khutbah, which is the sermon. And these become, there's an overview. The courtyard also is important. This is more of what I would call an Arab plan-styled mosque, not a domed mosque, but it has, as you can see there, the primary modules of a mosque. The mihrab. So the assumption is where the mihrab is, that wall there is perpendicular to the direction of Mecca when you go into a mosque. And this is probably the one way to identify a mosque. In Morocco, I'd often go into buildings, I'd often see buildings, and I simply knew they were mosques because of the mihrab inside a very simple space. The prayer hall, the masula, the entrance, iwan, that becomes important, because remember, mosques are being built in very tightly packed urban centers in the old Muslim, if I can use that term, world, where you can't see the mosque from the outside. They're not freestanding buildings. So you have these extraordinarily beautiful decorated entrances, iwans, that when you enter, you come into this extraordinary open space as well, the sahan, or the courtyard in English. And then the minaret. Here's an example of the courtyard. There's the minaret. And again, this is not Islamic in a certain context, but Islam uses it. This predates Islam, but the courtyard, as we know, has interfacing buildings that for the purpose of religion, for the purpose of washing, for the purpose of education, all center around a unity, and that unity is an enclosed but open space, which is a borrowing, I would argue, from the Roman tradition, which is a departure from the Greek tradition, because the Greeks enclose space, as you know, this way and open it that way, whereas the Muslims, borrowing from the Romans, enclose space this way and open it that way. And that's what you see here in these typical, unfortunately stereotypical, which I don't want to be, mosques. Arguably the oldest mosque in the world is the first mosque in the world, in the sense that it was built as a mosque without borrowing from pre-Islamic basilicas or centers, is this mosque here in Cairo, toward the end of the 9th century of the Common Era, where you see the minaret, the E1 entrances, and also in the center here, this enclosed space, which is over a pool for wudu, which is the ceremonial washing or purification that a Muslim is bound to perform before prayer. Minarets, as we know, they become highly stylized and decorative, and different cultures have their own kinds. Therefore, I would argue that the minaret is not Islamic. It is of a culture that is majority Muslim. Therefore, I would also argue that the mosque over here in Kilbirnie in Wellington is not as the New Zealand Encyclopedia Te Aro says it is, quote, a traditional Islamic styled minaret. I would say no, it's simply an Ottoman minaret, because Islam wouldn't reduce itself traditionally to a style. But nevertheless, cultures who become predominantly Muslim use their own styles to project into this concept of now, which is not, again, functionally necessary, but important to mark or to identify the mosque throughout the Muslim world. And as we know, and we'll look at these if you're interested in the course in much detail, how extraordinarily beautiful they are as a form of art. That's an Iwan. So we talk about the Iwan kinds of mosques, by which you have these grand entrances now. These are quite common in Persia, and they open into the closed space, or they lead out of the enclosed space into the open space. Again, focused around unity. The minarets behind the Iwan, and the place of wudu, where the Muslim boy is sitting, performing the ritual act of purification. This is an example of a mihrab, a niche, and you can see how everything we've looked at spills over now into a functional mosque module that's highly decorative. It certainly doesn't need to be, but arguably it is one of the most concentrated forms of Islamic art in the Muslim world, where it comes to the conjoining of Quranic scripts, arabesques. You can see the Kufi script around the top, for example, a verse from the Quran, and the Nashk script underneath, with this form again of the mukanas, where the imam would face inside the niche with his back toward the congregation, where he would pray the various prayers of the 5 prayers of the Muslim day. Another example of an extraordinary stucco arabesque mihrab. One of my favorites. This is the mihrab that may be familiar to some of you, of the famous Mestica, the mosque of Cordoba in Andalusia, in Spain. Notice the typical Moorish arch and the beauty of the inscription around the top as well, and the unity of the arches inside the arch. A modern mihrab in Istanbul. A minbar, a pulpit. This is what we would call a pulpit, and this is common in Friday mosques. In Islam, you have mosques throughout the cities of Muslim majority countries, though you have kind of like a cathedral, as we understand the cathedral concept, whereas it's like the church of an area, which is a diocese. You have many churches in the diocese, but you have one specific church. This is a word I don't like to use, but the cathedral mosque. We talk about the cathedral mosque, which is where the cathedra is, like the Friday mosque, where the Muslim community entire comes on a Friday by obligation to pray. They will have a minbar. You can distinguish the masjid from the Jammah masjid, the Friday mosque, by this. And this is just an example, but it does become highly stylized and very beautiful. This is in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Hagia Sophia, the mihrab, the minbar. As you can see, the entrance there symbolically to the steps that takes the imam up to turn and face the congregation to give the Friday sermon. This is a lovely modern mosque that's just been built, and you can see how simple the place of prayer is. It's just a niche in the wall, and here this would be the Qibla wall and the minbar. I put this on so you can just see the relationship between the two, the mihrab and the minbar. Again, in a more traditional, if I can use that word, style of mosque, you see the ornamentation of the mihrab and the minbar. Domes are important. They are not Islamic, but they become symbols of unity and beauty in Islam, and this is the dome of the Prophet's mosque in Islam. There are 4 important mosques in Islam, and the first is the Mosque of Mecca, Masjid al-Haram, the holiest site in Islam, and then the second one is the Masjid of the Prophet Muhammad, which was his house, and then rebuilt into a mosque. What we just saw, this is the mosque that is where the Prophet prayed before he entered Medina, when the Prophet left Mecca after monotheism wasn't too popular at the moment, when the Prophet was in Mecca. And therefore the Prophet leaves Mecca to go to Medina, and before entering Medina he prays. And where he prays, that was a place of sujood, and that also becomes an important mosque. It's not the mosque of the Prophet's house in Medina, it's the mosque where the Prophet first prayed, the Mizullah. This is the dome of the Mizullah. This is the third most holy place in Islam. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque, a beautiful place on the Temple Mount, where, as you can see the dome here over the Mizullah, this is where Muslims believe is the third most holy site in Islam, and it's where, according to the Islamic tradition, the Prophet was taken from his home in Medina on a night journey to the holy site of Abraham, where Abraham sacrifices his son, and the Prophet was carried up through the 7 heavens to the highest heaven of the lotus tree, and that's called the night journey of the Prophet, and the Miraj, the traveling and the going up. So this is considered the third holiest site in Islam, Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's in Jerusalem. And there it is again with the minaret and the dome. This is just a tessellation and a form of decoration from the Dome of the Rock, which I looked at before. This is inside the Dome of the Rock to show how ornamentally decorated it is. Also, this is Moorish arches that you'll find throughout Spain today, Andalusia and North Africa, that become stereotypically Islamic in a certain way, but important signs of unity and oneness again, through which you don't just have the one overall formation, you have the arch within the arch, and which again is just borrowing from architectural forms and morphemes to create this idea of beauty in unity, or the oneness of the attributes of God, so to speak. This is the minarets of the mosque of Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. That is the mosque of the Prophet's house today.
What, sorry?
The mosque of the Prophet's house, where the Prophet Muhammad, where his own home was a place where he prayed. And that becomes now today an important place in Islam, therefore the Prophet's mosque in Medina. Decoration inside. This is an example of a transformation of a pre-existent building into a mosque. This is the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, in Syria. And I find this fascinating because you can see certainly how it has the pediment, for example, the Greek pediment there, and this extraordinary mosaic decoration that is perfectly acceptable and understandable and explainable in the Islamic tradition too, and kept. There it is again, from another perspective, inside with its surface decoration of calligraphy and tessellations and arabesques. In Uzbekistan, a projection into architecture also of a local artistic formation. I'm passing over these quickly simply for a question of time to introduce you to what is an extraordinary richness also in colour formation and tessellations. Isfahan in Persia. Characteristic of Islamic in a certain way. It's Abu Dhabi in the Arabic Emirates, though recognizable as a mosque architecturally. This, though, I wanted to simply introduce you to because it's considered absolutely beautiful in Islam. And this is a mosque. And this is what I was trying to explain before. One of the most important things, and the only legal requirement for the place of prayer, is that it be a clean area. So a Muslim in the desert, or a Muslim in the bush, or wherever a Muslim may find themselves, or a small group of Muslims who gather, will simply discover the direction towards Mecca and make a space that is clean where they come together to pray. Therefore, this is a mosque, as is that, which is considered sacred. But it's not, because the hadith also say that all the world is a mosque. According to the hadith of Muslim and Bukhari, Muhammad said, "The world has been made a mosque for me." And I think we have to understand that in no other way other than the sanctity and the beauty of the entire universe and the world by which a Muslim will pray when the time comes for prayer wherever the Muslim finds themselves. That's all. And when there is a Muslim community or a few Muslims, they come together to do that for the same reason all religions do. There again is a mosque. Technically, legally, it's not. I'm not making an important distinction. I don't have time, but we have to look at this either from a cosmological point of view as opposed to a legal point of view. Nevertheless, it is a mazula, but I would argue also a mosque, because the Islamic tradition sees all the places of prayer, even before the Prophet, where Jesus prayed, where Jesus bowed down, where Maryam prayed, where Yusuf, Abraham, Moses, where all the prophets, where Adam prayed, is a mosque, masjid, place of prayer. A modern mosque, again, I'll quickly move through these. A mosque, where arguably, certainly nothing traditional about this, a stylistic form of architecture in a modernist form that becomes an open space where Muslims gather to pray as well. The interior of the Istanbul mosque. In Saudi Arabia, this is also a mosque and a minaret. And I wanted to simply show you this as well to make a point. If you see this to the naked eye, you'll consider it a church, I'm sure. But this is the Dublin Mosque. And what I'm trying to show you here is what is also considered beautiful about Islam is its extraordinary accommodating spirit and adaptability. And despite all the beautiful mosques throughout the world that we do associate with majority Muslim countries, that needn't be the case. And the example of the Prophet showed that by which he transformed his own house into a mosque, or his own house was a mosque, and also the places where Muslims went to when they spread, they adopt those buildings and make them mosques too. So here we have, obviously, if I may make the assumption, a Christian church that no longer functions as a Christian church, but also arguably a wonderful place where Christians can still come to pray to God insofar as Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Put a crescent on it, which of course is a symbol. It might identify it to many people now as a mosque. And finally, in the prophets and their words and deeds. I won't go into this, but of course this is a very important part of beauty in Islam, because as well as the Quran, which is considered to be the will and law of God revealed to humankind in a temporal context, there is what the Prophet Muhammad did and said, which when you look into it is extraordinarily beautiful. And when you read the verses in the Quran of the Prophet's words, which are Quranic verses, and when you trap in historical documents which took place around the 9th century, what the Prophet did and said, which is the so-called tradition of Islam, without questioning that tradition, but trying to understand it, because that's what a theologian does, and that's what I would do. The fundamental difference between me and, for example, a professor of religious studies or a social scientist, they would not use those religious sources. A theologian would, not in a critical way, but in a comprehensive way to try to understand what they mean. And when you look at the words and deeds of the Prophet, which are called the Sunnah in Islam, when you trap those also in written accounts, which are called the Hadith, and you read them, they're extraordinary, beautiful regarding the goodness and the promotion of beauty and the promotion of truth according to the Islamic system. And of course that's very attractive. And that's not just of the Prophet Muhammad. When you read the Hadith, there is a wonderful hadith by which Bukhari says that Allah gave to the Prophet Yusuf half of the beauty in the universe. Of course, how we understand that is analogous. But nevertheless, there's a meaning behind that, that obviously Joseph was a beautiful person, but the beauty is not only in physical appearance. It's in the goodness of the actions and the goodness of the speech. And that's true of Jesus as well. Jesus, Muslims see, of course, as Ibn Miriam, Messiah, Ibn Miriam, which means the Messiah, the son of Mary. And from the Quran, Jesus is called Ibn Messiah, Miriam. Messiah, anointed one of God. Anointed one of God. Therefore, a sign, ayah, to the world, and Muslims find that is very beautiful. Therefore, the respect that Muslims have toward the Prophet Jesus in Islam is extraordinary as well. So again, it's not just about the beauty of the acts and deeds of Muhammad, but also of the major prophets of Islam as well. And we've looked at this already. The sixth place, of course, is in God's self. And Muslims are shy to talk about what theology does, which is seen by many Muslims, apart from Muslim scholars of the Quran, as a daring act to try to understand the nature of God. And that's fine, but that's what theology tends to try to do. But this is done in Islam through treaties, and one of the most beautiful is by Al-Ghazali, who's a 13th century Islamic theologian and Muslim scholar, and he explains the relationship between Allah's essence, therefore the divine names of the being of Allah, which is unrevealed, therefore apophatic, apophasis, hidden, or to use the Arabic term, al-batin, then those that Allah extends into the world. And there are so many, and they usually revolve around creation, which I think in the Christian tradition we would call the acts of God ad extra, meaning extended into the world. Okay, so to conclude from my point of view, and I think this is the best way to understand Islam, there are two forms of beauty in Islam. One, ordinary beauty, which is derived by the senses, making the eye and the ear responsible for such beauty, usually relative to God's creation and to human arts. And there are various kinds of this beauty and the human perception of it. And two, the beauty connected with God's names and the religious insight associated with knowing those names and knowing the will and law of God revealed through the Quran, which is considered also very beautiful, and equated with knowledge, which is equated with goodness and faith and good deeds. So, to sum up, in the end, there are 6 places where beauty can be identified or looked at in Islam: in the world, through creation and evolution; in the Muslims' fundamental acts or Islam's 5 pillars; in the arts, through sensory manifestation, specifically through shapes, Quranic recitation, sounds, and the movement of the body; in Islam's 2 main institutions, the Quran and the mosque, and the corresponding arts; and in the prophets and their words and deeds; and finally in God and in the divine attributes. The first 5 all fall into the area of ordinary beauty, and the last one would fall into the category or the form, if you could, of extraordinary or supernatural beauty. Gosh. I've done it again and gone what I would consider overtime.
Yes, we did promise questions. We like to keep promises. Is there a desperately urgent question? If not, then this was a feast, wasn't it? It was an invitation to contemplate beauty and to turn in that direction, to turn away from Western arrogance and bitterness, turn away from the jihadists' hatred. We thank Dr. Longhurst for richness of information and aid to interfaith behaviour, tolerance. Sorry about the noisy neighbours. Now you can keep in touch via the website because we have an ongoing series of lectures of this kind. Now, Dr. Longhurst is also doing this as an extended series under the auspices of Victoria University of Wellington. If you're interested in that, then bail him up in short time. Thank you very much for coming. Goodbye.